the Impostor Syndrome Files. I am so grateful that you're here, and I really hope that you've been enjoying the conversations that you've been listening to, and hopefully finding some tips, some next steps that you can take if you struggle with similar feelings of self-doubt, which obviously, as you're hearing, are fairly universal. This is something that we all go through from time to time. When I started this podcast, my goal was really to try to normalize the experience, to let everybody know that you are not alone, that there's a name for what you're feeling, and that there are steps that we can be taking to manage it more effectively. What I have found over the course of these conversations has been fascinating. I have had an absolutely powerful and different conversation with every single person who I have interviewed. I worried at one point that there may not be enough to talk about. How much is there to say about imposter syndrome? Are the stories going to start to get repetitive? That has absolutely not been the case. Everyone brings a fascinating new perspective to this conversation. I have learned something from every discussion that we've had. I hope you have too. I want to make a note that many of these recordings are being done during the social distancing that's happening with coronavirus. I am doing my best to protect the sound quality, but we are all in homes that have pets, kids, all kinds of background noise going on. For me, it's much more important to share with you a very natural conversation between two people than it is to share a perfectly polished recording. So I hope that you will bear with us if there are moments where the sound is not perfect. Really, my goal is to share stories, not to provide perfectly scripted, perfectly polished audio. So apologies for any imperfections that may be coming through in the recordings, but I'm hoping that you're getting the essence of the message regardless. So thank you again for being here. I wish you all the best and hope that you will consider sharing your own story one day. Thanks again. All right. Welcome, Jenny. I am so happy to have you here today. I'd love to start by having you introduce yourself.
Thanks, Kim. I'm so excited to be here. I am a licensed clinical therapist, a leadership coach, a panelist, a speaker, a best-selling author, a podcaster. I like to stay busy.
Sounds like it.
So my therapy practice is called Forward in Heels, and it's for badass women who want to excel at what they do, stand tall, and own their worth so they can light up the world. And I work individually with women, largely in New York City, although as of right now, we are in a global pandemic, so kind of wherever anybody is. And the podcast is called Feminist AF, and we just talk about all things feminism.
I love it. So I am going to guess that you are not a stranger to imposter syndrome.
No, ma'am.
So I'd love to hear what you think about imposter syndrome. What does it mean to you? How, if at all, has it shown up in your life or in your work?
Yeah. So I had to think about this for a while, not just for our conversation, but in general. And I realized that I spent so much of my 20s getting more and more education. And that was, yes, because I love to learn and I love, bringing new pieces of information, but also I had to admit for validation, for having someone pat me on the head and say, yes, we now believe that you know how to do this thing because you have a piece of paper. And not knowing how, when I went into private practice, how to really sell that and feeling a little bit icky about the sale and just wanting to say, look at my degrees, I can prove that I know stuff. And really it's about the showing, not just the pointing to the degrees. And that was something I really had to grapple with and reconcile because people still question me and challenge me. And I can't just say, well, I have 2 master's degrees, so trust me. It really has to be in the work I do.
That's so interesting because I talk about this a lot. And I talk about the fact that as women, we have a tendency to take an academic approach to life because that's typically a time of success in our lives. We do pretty well in general in those types of environments. Do you? And I know you work with women as well, so I'm not sure how much visibility you have into this, but do you see that in men as well? Because I don't necessarily see that same sense of I'm going to go back and get another degree, or I need to prove myself through credentials?
Yeah, you see it less with men. And I've actually done a lot of research on this, of course, because I also used to work in education. And so wanting to really understand what are biological origins of sex differences in how children learn and how they grow developmentally, and what are social differences. And it's really hard to tease the two apart because, from the moment a baby's born, we gender them and we say, if a baby is bald, we're like, oh, he, as if that means anything with an infant. And so we're always gendering babies and with clothing and with toys, and it just starts early. So some of it, though, is biological, and boys and girls' brains are wired differently from the start. Even things like in the first 9 months, the way girls respond to human faces more frequently, smiles, and eye contact, and boys respond to movement like mobiles. And then it extends into early childhood where boys really do, we say they seek out more adrenaline and adventure, and they have more broken bones. And again, part of that I'm sure is socialized, which is, girls should be nice and dainty and not be dirty. But part of it is a biological drive to push boundaries for boys. And so as they get older, part of the reason school is somewhere where girls are more successful is because, literally things like more teachers are female, and girls can hear higher registers better at that age, and boys have a hard time hearing higher voices. And so they often actually miss what was said by a female teacher, and then they're seen as not paying attention or being disruptive if they ask again or if they ask their neighbor. And so much of this is tied up, and girls are really good at following the rules and raising their hands when they're supposed to, and listening to the rules. And I was a middle school teacher years ago, and I know that as much as I tried to create an environment where I would say, everybody has to raise their hands, this is an egalitarian society, what would happen was the girls would raise their hands, the boys would raise their hands and shout out. And I know that even if I was saying to them, you have to raise your hand, I was still giving validation to the boys by giving them attention. And I know, and I hate this, in hindsight, that I then told my girls a message, which was boys still have different rules. Even though I said everybody raises their hands, I still responded to him, even if all I said was, you have to raise your hand, you can't shout out. So they learn that rules are different. And so they learn that following the rules is what they have to do. So then fast forward to adulthood, women and men get into the workforce. And we've all heard the research that, women will wait till they have 10 out of 10 credentials to even apply for a job or a promotion. And men will say, I've got 4 out of 10 and I'll wing the rest. They'd be lucky to have me. I have potential. So it just starts early and it just expands throughout life.
It's so fascinating. I love that you've done that research too, because it's so interesting. And it's interesting to me because I see so much of this. It was my own personal experience, and now working with women, of how much we try to hang on to that academic approach, the study habits, the ways in which we were successful in that space as we enter the workplace, and we get this rude awakening. And it's often doesn't come in the form of positive, constructive information. It's more of learning the hard way, right? That don't work that way anymore. How do you see this connecting to imposter syndrome?
Yeah. So, just go back to that example of women saying, I need 10 out of 10. They're already taking themselves out of the running. And so whenever I work with a woman who wants a promotion or an opportunity, I will say to them, let them reject you. It is not the end of the world if you go for a promotion and you don't get it. But if you don't go, you've already decided that you're not going to get it. So there's either a potential here that may end the way you think it will, or you can guarantee the ending. And I would love to see you just try, because I cannot tell you how many times in my personal life and in the life of the women I work with, and even my friends, where they ask for something and then they get it. This is such a silly example, but during this pandemic, I have gone around to all of my subscriptions, right? MailChimp and Zoom. And I'm just like, hey, can I have a discount? And they're like, sure. People don't think to ask for the simplest things. So now I've got 3 months free on MailChimp just because I asked. It's such a silly thing, but what happens if they say no? I'm paying exactly what I paid yesterday and no change, but they said yes, and now I have a discount.
Wow. Now you got me thinking. I love that though, because you're absolutely right. Obviously, if we don't ask, we don't get, right? So what do you think is the underlying fear there? Does it really come down to just not wanting to be rejected? What are we afraid of?
Well, I will say this certainly doesn't explain all of it away, but there are some sort of I don't know what you want to call them, like pithy quotes. That's like, a man's biggest fear is being rejected. A woman's biggest fear is being murdered because she rejected someone. And I think there is something to be said for the gender-based violence and constructs that we have in the world. That, if a man, and so much of it is, again, insidious and intertwined, and think about rom-coms and movies where, she says she's not interested, and all that tells him is that he has to try harder. So I really do think there is some element of this that we are, we're not just afraid of rejection. We're afraid of all the other layered consequences that come with either telling someone else no or asking for something that we are maybe told that we don't deserve or we don't have any right to ask for. And maybe that's just by society at large, or maybe it's by someone in our actual lives. But there's a lot to be said for this layered, gendered, patriarchy, yes, but also kyriarchy is a word I like because it takes it beyond just patriarchy's binary. It's, gendered, but kyriarchy is the systems of every piece of your identity, whether it's your sexual orientation or your race or your ethnicity, which can be different from race, or your gender identity, which can be different from your assigned gender or sex at birth. There are so many layered nuances to it, and so many of our systems intersect. And so I think that there is a lot to it that is the messages that we receive from the world at large about our own position and our own safety in the world.
Wow, you're right. And it gets me thinking about the conversations I have with women who are afraid of asking for, let's just use as an example, asking for a raise. And when you dig more deeply into it, of course, they're afraid of being rejected in that case, right? But they're also really afraid of changing the dynamic of what that's going to do to the relationship overall if they have overstepped, right? If they have asked for something that the other person sees as inappropriate.
Mm-hmm.
So what you're talking about is, in some cases, of course, it's imagined based on past experience. In other cases, it's real.
Mm-hmm.
How do we tell the difference, or knowing that that's a possibility, that there will be larger consequences? How do we navigate that?
Yeah, it's such a hard question because it's so situational. And so what that does is it requires women to, be operating on this higher level of not just the interaction that they are experiencing right at that moment, but also what are all the dynamics at play here, seen and unseen, which is exhausting. And so I think, some of it is just simply education, is simply saying to someone, I'm curious, you gave me feedback that I should smile more, but I'm not sure that I've ever heard you say that to my male colleague. Is that something that you give as general feedback, right? That's non-aggressive, non-attacking, but points out a very specific piece of feedback that only women get for the most part. Then depending on how that person reacts, that's how you know where to go from there. And I use that as an example because it happened in my life years ago when I had a boss. And when I said that to him, he got very red and defensive and said, what I say to other employees is not your business. And I was like, so that does tell me that this is only for me.
Yeah, I like that a lot too, because I'm a big fan of taking a curiosity-based approach to these types of conversations. What did that do to your long-term relationship? Do you think that asking that question had any long-term implications one way or the other?
Definitely. Unfortunately, I do think that some people are very entrenched in their beliefs, especially, I will say, I don't know how better to say this, but like nice white folks, they tend to be very entrenched in their beliefs that they are not racist, and therefore they couldn't possibly ever say something that is racist or sexist or, classist or ableist because they're not that person. And we all have our biases. Every single one of us, no matter if you are every day doing social justice work, you have a bias. We all do. And the work is addressing it, not even confronting it because that's very aggressive, but sometimes just like turning it over and saying, you know what, maybe I don't say that to the male, employees here. Unfortunately, that was not a space where he wanted to have those conversations. He was in charge and I was not, and I needed to know my role, to your point before. Like there was no changing that dynamic. So I, at that point, was mostly focused on changing the situation around me, meaning having conversations with my colleagues who are on my level, as opposed to trying to jump up a few steps to where he was. But unfortunately, it just ended up not working. And I think sometimes that has to be okay too. We're so defined by our jobs, and being fired or being reprimanded in some way often has such an outsized impact on us. And really, I always say to people, why would you want to date someone who doesn't want to date you? Why would you want a job that doesn't fit, that you don't fit? It's not even like you're having a great time and you're super happy there and they just don't like it. That's never how it goes, because that everything is a dynamic relationship. And so if they're not happy with your work, odds are you're not extremely happy with being there. There are things that aren't working. And much like any relationship, at some point you have to examine, is this not working enough that we both need to part ways and find better fits?
I absolutely love that and agree with you wholeheartedly. I do think that we take on a lot of the burden of the relationship, so to speak, right? Just as you're describing it almost as a personal relationship, right? A work relationship is a relationship. We have a relationship to our employer. We take on a lot of that burden. And often when things aren't working, we turn it on ourselves and say, there must be something wrong with me, right? Mm-hmm. If only I did this better or did more or less of this, then it would work, right? How do we know when we've reached the point where it's just not a fit and it's time to move on?
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, the annoying answer is it depends.
The weight of the world on your shoulders. I'm just curious about how you think about it. Obviously, there's no simple answer to these questions, or we'd be in a different world right now.
Sure. Yeah. I think it is, I always say this to my clients, if they are in a relationship, again, romantic, friendship, work-wise, whatever it is, where they're coming to me with, I need this to be better in some way. And I'll start out by saying to them, I really hate that I'm about to put more emotional labor on you, but you're the only person in front of me. The other person isn't here and they're not asking these questions. So right now we can only focus on what's within your control. That means for a little while or a long while, depending how long you want to do this, you're going to bear that burden. So just let's start there. Because we put a lot of emotional labor on women to navigate those relationships and to, juggle all the plates. And we don't ask a lot of other people to do the same thing, whether it's just because that person's in a position of power or because they are not the ones asking that question. So I think it is like anything. I always want to focus on what you can control and what you can't. And that goes for anything. That goes for when you're stressed out about, the world at large, and you're stressed out about, violence or danger, or again, a pandemic, and saying, okay, well, a lot of those things are out of your control, but what's within your control? The pandemic, as an example, you can wear a mask, you can wash your hands, you can limit your contact with people. Even if your environment, your city or state is opening up, you don't have to choose to partake in that. And people often forget that they don't have to do what's offered to them. And so I think that, to answer your question, it's, have you done everything that's within your control? Have you said everything that you know how to say in a way that is their language? So again, it's a lot of work on your end, but is it, you might say, I want you to be more emotionally present. And someone else might not know what that means. And so you need to use the language that makes sense to them. And maybe that means really concrete, I need you to plan a date night once a month if it's a personal relationship. It might feel like a lot and very frustrating to be the one who has all the solutions. But I always say, then the alternative is you're, again, back to the job thing, then you definitely aren't going to get what you want because you're not telling them what you want. So maybe you do have to do the work of saying, I would really like not to be told that I have to smile in my job performance, because I think there are other key indicators of my performance that we could focus on, such as Again, at some point you have to say, they are not interested in hearing me. They are not able to hear me. They are not able to do the work that would make this relationship better. And now I have to make a decision. And sometimes that decision is still staying, but lessening your expectations of whatever it is. Again, romantic, friendship, job, whatever. Maybe this job, the benefits outweigh this lack of validation, and you have to reframe how you see it. So a lot of it is that internal work, and then getting to a point of saying, I have done everything in my power. Now it's time to change environments.
I really like what you're talking about in terms of taking control of what's within your control and not taking responsibility for what's outside of it, right? I think that's a very empowering approach. And thinking about it from a confidence perspective, then, right? Then if you ultimately make the decision, I'm going to stay, I'm going to go, You know that you're doing it on your terms, that you've done what you can do.
Yep.
Yeah. What else do you see when it comes to imposter syndrome in the women that you're working with? I mean, I often talk about triggers like transitions, feeling different from the people around you. Are there patterns or themes that you see in your work?
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of it manifests as self-esteem. So it's, well, I'm not qualified to do that, or, well, I can't, whatever. Not to keep bringing everything back to the pandemic, but it's sort of everything right now. So, I have clients who, we've been talking about, them pursuing new jobs or careers even for months, sometimes years, and just trying to put all the ducks in a row and get that into place. And as soon as this pandemic hit, it was like, well, of course I can't apply for a new job. And I was like, well, says who? Well, nobody's hiring. Well, who's nobody? Lots of companies are hiring, maybe not the ones that you're hearing about on the news, but this is where you need to take control and say, where am I getting my information? Who is hiring? Think about the companies whose stock is skyrocketing right now. I've seen nothing but ads for Zoom, Rosetta Stone, Talkspace, BetterHelp, Instacart, anything that can get to you in your home through the roof. And so I say to them, this isn't just this black and white either or, oh, I'm allowed to apply for a job or I'm not right now because other people are unemployed. Well, that's not within your control. Right back to this. What is in your control is your resume, your skills. And look, maybe you need to spend the next couple of months building up a skill set in something very particular that will catapult you to the next level. That's fine. You got nothing but time. But to say, oh, I can't, is one of those manifestations of imposter syndrome that we don't always realize that's what it is. We think, oh, well, I just, unemployment is really high right now, so I can't. And it's like, well, why does that affect you? How is that your problem?
Yes. I often talk about the connection between imposter syndrome and fear and just assumptions that we're making. I think you're absolutely right. And there is, in some sense, especially given the times that we're in, right, this justification for staying where we are, right? Because it avoids fear. It avoids that anxiety of making a change, which is always scary under the best of circumstances. But especially now, when the world is changing in such unpredictable ways, there is a tendency to want to just hunker down, right? And so it's easier to say, oh, well, the unemployment rate is really high than it is to look at yourself and try to make those kinds of adjustments.
Yep.
Yeah. So, and I talked too about the fact that imposter syndrome and the messages that we tell ourselves, however harshly they may come across, right, of I'm not good enough, I don't belong here, etc., are often designed to keep us from that uncertainty, the threat of harm, right, too. It's a fear response in many ways.
Mm-hmm.
You talk about fear obviously you do, but like what's your general view of the role that fear plays in these kinds of situations that we're talking about? And do you have a tip or two that you would share?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I actually always love to bring it back to neurobiology because our brains are both very complex and very primitive in some ways. And so I always start by validating that your fear plays a role. It has a purpose in your life. It keeps you safe and alive. So, don't assume that just because you're afraid of something means you're somehow weak or failing. It is your brain going, hey, like red flag, like, is this something that's going to kill us? Because that's really how your brain works. And so when we're afraid of something, it is because there's some element of it that our brain is saying like, hey, this might be a threat to us. But what I mean by also being very primitive is that we're still stuck in fight, flight, or freeze. None of those work in the modern world. You can't just stand still and play dead or punch your boss in the throat or run away when you don't like the conversation that you're having, right? So we need to develop better coping skills because our primitive skills do not work in the modern world, but that's how our brain is wired. So if we're not really consciously working to add to that toolbox, we're stuck in those three responses and none of them are very helpful in any sort of modern world. So we can name the fear. We can say I am afraid that I'm going to look for a new job, get something really exciting, and then lose it because the economy is going to tank. Well, That could happen. So what can we do between now and then to, bulk up your savings? What can we do to add on a side hustle? What can we do to make you feel more secure by, investing in real estate? What is it that would make you feel better about this? Is it about talking to your family, your partner, whomever, to make sure that you have these safety nets? It isn't always, I'm afraid, so I shouldn't do it. It's, okay, I'm afraid, and what can I do with that information? Because it is telling me something. It's not just, there's no biological drive that we have that's unhelpful. Everything serves a purpose, and we have to remember that. So then we say, okay, if I'm afraid, there's a reason. It doesn't mean the reason is don't do it. The reason is let's examine further and dig deeper and see, again, what can we control and what can't we?
Yeah, and I think that examination process is the key, right? Because we're responding, as you said, in very natural ways that have protected us as a species. But to take the driver's seat, so to speak, when those kinds of responses creep up on us, right, we have to apply more of a cognitive approach to the situation. Mm-hmm. Right. I think just catching yourself when it's happening and then making that conscious choice to examine it makes a huge difference, regardless of what the ultimate decision is that you make from there.
Yep. And I think I can't stress enough how hard it is to get to the point of the noticing part. Mm-hmm. We think like we just have to jump right to fixing the problem, but we have been operating the way we've been operating for however many years we've been alive up to this point. We've decided to start examining something. You don't undo that overnight. And so I always remind my clients that, even if you just come in one day and you say, I noticed that I was being antagonistic in this way, which is something we've been talking about for months or years, that's a huge win. Just because your next sentence is, but I couldn't stop myself, that's fine. That's not even the goal right now. When we're starting to undo learned behaviors of 20, 30, 50 years, just the noticing is a huge leap forward. It's actually more of a leap forward to observe your own behaviors than to do anything about it. It's like, this, what's that? The hockey stick, like the long, slow bottom. And then the leap up is actually just going from observing to changing the behavior. That's where the easier work is done. It's, we do things unconsciously every second of every day. If we had to consciously be aware of every motion we took and every movement, we would never get out of bed because it would be like open eyelids, move right arm. Like you'd spend all day doing it.
Exactly. Is there anything else that you would share with people in terms of action steps or anything that you share with your clients as a tip that will help them to, even if it's very simple and just step one, right, help them to move forward as it relates to this larger conversation that we're having?
Yeah. So I've said it throughout this conversation. The number one thing is what can you control and what can't you? And I use that in my own life when I'm starting to get overwhelmed by something or stressed out. I have to sit down and say, what is within my control and what isn't? And often there have been times where literally the only thing within my control is saying none of this is in my control and I need to accept that. But that alone, that small, okay, is, again, your brain is like, okay, got it. I'm a big fan of journaling. And I know a lot of my type A's, myself included, are like, journaling. I don't want to meditate all the time. But, it's really, again, it's functional because what happens is our brains are so great at keeping a bunch of short-term ideas in the forefront in case we need them, that's what happens when we ruminate, right? When we can't sleep. It's our brain going, well, you said you needed this and you said you needed this and you haven't resolved this. And then we feel really stressed out. And truly the act of taking pen to paper, more so than typing, there's a hardwired difference between typing and taking pen to paper, taking out a journal and saying, even if all you write is, here's everything I'm stressed out about, here's everything I can't control, here's everything I have to do that I can't get to, your brain goes, oh, cool. Okay, so you wrote it down. So it's no longer has to be held in my short-term memory because you put it somewhere, taken care of. And I cannot tell you the number of times that myself and anybody else that I've suggested this to then goes to sleep like a baby. You think you're never going to fall asleep because your brain is just like, I have so much to do. You write it down and it's like, snap the fingers. And so between focusing on what you can control and what you can't, then journaling just, here's everything I'm stressed out about. And then a third thing I like, which is a little bit, higher level, is positive reframing. And positive reframing is a strategy that takes a lot of practice, and it is not the same thing as being positive all the time. It doesn't mean that nothing bad's allowed to happen. It means that when something happens, you can reframe it. So for example, you might say, I can't believe I'm stuck in this house with my family for the foreseeable future. This sucks. Okay. Sure. That might be true. And you can add in, I can't believe I'm stuck in this house with my family for the foreseeable future. I am so grateful that they exist and there's a roof over my head, and I am super stressed out about what the future holds. Right? It doesn't take away your stressed out feeling. It adds in a layer of, and there's another part of this truth that isn't all bad. And it just reminds us that we can't just paint with these broad brushstrokes of like all good, all bad, because that is not how the world works and it's not how humanity works. So just like, reframing when you add in something that you're like, I can be both grateful and stressed out, reminds us that we can hold multiple complex thoughts at once. We're very complicated people. We can do a lot of fancy things with our brains. And sometimes we get stuck in thinking that our brains are in charge of us when it's really the other way around.
I love this conversation so much. I feel like I could just keep going all day. You've shared so many great insights. I would love to wrap up by just asking you a couple questions. What motivated you to want to be here today? And what are you hoping people will take away from this?
Yeah. So I work in a soft field, for lack of a better term. I'm a therapist. I get dismissed sometimes about, oh, what? So you just sit in a room and charge people a lot of money to say, oh, and how do you feel about that? And it's so dismissive and it's so denigrating. And then the opposite of that is that sometimes I'll meet someone in the real world and I'll just be myself, which is, forthright and strong and opinionated. And then they'll find out I'm a therapist and I'll get a snarky comment about not being very nice, as if that's the goal. And, it's not about constant validation or asking how you feel about your feelings. Therapy is also action. And I want people to understand that you can be strong in your convictions and compassionate and vulnerable. And more of us would benefit from realizing that all those things can exist together. Most things in our lives aren't either or. And if we just realize how overlapping our identities can be, a lot of us would be a lot better integrated in our identities, and we'd be so much happier, not trying to fit a square peg into a round hole by saying like, oh, well, I'm a therapist, therefore I'm supposed to be, nice like a preschool teacher. Well, that doesn't serve a lot of people who know how they feel. They just don't know what to do about it. And so I think that trying to navigate this space of these messages that other people tell you how you're supposed to be in, your relationship, in your life, in your parenthood, in your job. I think that there is a way to be strong in who you are and not necessarily create enemies. I think that's something that I myself have definitely pendulum swung back and forth on, being strong in my convictions and therefore not caring what other people think, and coming back to the center more so now in my adulthood and saying, I can be strong in my convictions. There's something to be said for catching more flies with honey than vinegar. And, I always have to examine, am I being polite and collaborative, or am I being deferential because there's some outdated expectation that seeped into my brain right now? So it's a lot of thinking about thinking for me. And so I just want to model that you can be someone who is introspective and compassionate and, strong and forthright and feminist and all these things. And that a lot of our identities have to be crafted by us, but too often we let it be crafted by somebody else. And that there is a way forward that is authentic to you.
Wow. That is such a powerful message. And thank you so much for being here today and having this conversation with me.
Thank you so much for having me, Kim. This was amazing.
Thank you so much for listening today. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and share it with other women who can benefit from this conversation. Before we go, I want to share some additional resources with you. If you struggle with imposter syndrome and you want to manage it more effectively, I invite you to join my free Impostor Syndrome online challenge. Every day for 7 days, you'll get an email with self-reflection questions and exercises to help you better understand your own experience with imposter syndrome and how to navigate it more effectively. To join the free challenge, visit executivecareersuccess.com/imposter-syndrome-challenge. When you sign up, you'll immediately receive your first message. Also, if you're interested in joining a community of women who engage in candid conversations that generally aren't happening elsewhere, I invite you to join my Leading Women discussion group. On the first and third Thursday of every month at 12 p.m. Eastern, we meet virtually over Zoom to talk about questions or challenges related to career management, leadership development, and any other relevant topics such as imposter syndrome and confidence.
It's always a great discussion with a great group of women. If you want to check it out, you're welcome to be my guest on a future call. Just reach out to me at kim@executivecareersuccess.com and I will share the call details with you. And if you want to join my newsletter to receive tips, insights, and updates, text Leading Women, all one word, to 66866. Finally, consider telling us your story. Contact me to learn more about how you can be a guest on the Impostor Syndrome Files. Thanks again and have a wonderful day.